My husband said, "Happy 30th anniversary, darling." That same day, I found out he was cheating. So I did what any 72-year-old woman would do when her entire world crumbled in a single afternoon. But let me start from the beginning, because the way he said those words that morning, soft and tender against my cheek, while I stood at our kitchen sink in our little house on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, will haunt me forever. The golden sunlight was streaming through our lace curtains, making everything look perfect, making me believe we were perfect, and I actually smiled thinking about how lucky I was to have a man who still remembered our special day after 30 years of raising kids, paying bills, and growing old together side by side. I had already planned our celebration dinner at Morrison's restaurant, the same place where he proposed back in 1994, and I'd even bought a new blue dress that made me feel pretty again despite my aging body that wasn't what it used to be. The morning felt like a blessing, like proof that real love could survive anything life threw at it. And I remember humming our old wedding song while I folded his shirts and planned how we'd spend our evening reminiscing about 3 decades of memories. I had no idea that by sunset, those loving words would become the cruelest irony of my life, and I discovered just how strong a broken woman can be. Before I tell you exactly what I found and what I did next, please subscribe and share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes the most important stories are the hardest ones to tell. 30 years ago, I was Mildred Grace Patterson, a 22-year-old waitress at Murphy's Diner on Main Street with dreams bigger than Cedar Falls could hold, serving coffee and apple pie to farmers and factory workers while saving every tip I earned in a mason jar hidden under my bed. Dreaming of going to nursing school in Des Moines and maybe seeing something of the world beyond Iowa's endless cornfields. I had my whole life mapped out in my mind, complete with a career helping people heal and maybe eventually moving to a big city where nobody knew my name or my family's reputation for being poor, but proud. But when Robert Thompson walked through those glass doors in his mechanic's coveralls with grease permanently embedded under his fingernails and the kindest brown eyes I'd ever seen, my carefully planned future suddenly seemed less important than the way he made my heart skip when he smiled. He wasn't the handsomest man in town, not by a long shot, especially compared to the college boys who came through during harvest season with their fancy cars and smooth talk. But Robert had this way of looking at me, like I was the only woman who mattered in the entire world, like I was precious and worth protecting and cherishing. And when he finally worked up the courage to ask me out after 3 months of leaving extra large tips and stuttering through awkward small talk about the weather, I knew without a doubt that I'd found my forever person. We got married on a crisp October morning in 1994 at the small white church on 5th Street with nothing but $27 in our joint bank account, a borrowed wedding dress that belonged to my sister Margaret, who was 2 sizes bigger than me, and promises we swore before God and our families that we'd keep until death do us part. And for 30 long years, I believed with every fiber of my being that we had kept those sacred vows. I gave up my dream of nursing school without a second thought to help him build Thompson's auto repair from nothing more than a rented garage and a toolbox his father left him, spending countless nights doing his books by lamplight at our kitchen table while he worked 16-hour days under the hoods of broken-down Fords and Chevrolets, believing wholeheartedly that his success would be our success. His dreams would become our shared dreams. His future would be the future we'd build together. I cooked his meals from scratch every single day, washing his grease-stained coveralls by hand because we couldn't afford the laundromat, raised our 2 children, Sarah and Michael, mostly alone, while he worked dawn to dusk 7 days a week, and never once complained about the sacrifices because I thought we were building something beautiful and lasting together. Something that would stand the test of time like the old oak tree in our backyard that had weathered every storm and season for over a century. When the kids finally left for college, Sarah to study teaching at Iowa State and Michael to learn agriculture at the university, I thought we'd finally have time for each other again. Time to rediscover the young couple who used to dance in the kitchen to the radio and stay up all night talking about our dreams and making plans for when Robert's business would be successful enough for us to take a real vacation. Maybe even see the ocean I'd always dreamed about. But instead of growing closer, Robert just worked more hours, came home later and later each night, and started treating our house like nothing more than a hotel where he slept and ate, but never really lived or connected with me. And when I tried to talk to him about it, he'd just mumble something about needing to expand the business and provide for our future, leaving me feeling invisible in my own home. That morning of our 30th anniversary started like something out of a fairy tale, with me waking up before dawn feeling giddy as a schoolgirl because I'd been planning this celebration for weeks, determined to make it the most special day we'd had in years and prove to myself that our marriage was still worth celebrating. I tiptoed to the kitchen in my old pink robe, the one Robert always said made me look like cotton candy, and started making his favorite breakfast of buttermilk pancakes from scratch, the recipe my grandmother taught me when I was 8 years old, mixing the batter by hand while the coffee percolated and filled our little kitchen with that rich aroma that meant home and comfort and everything good in the world. I set the table with our wedding china, the delicate white plates with tiny blue roses that we only use for Christmas and anniversaries, arranging fresh daisies from my garden in the center, because Robert once told me I was as pretty as a daisy and I wanted everything to be perfect. Wanted to remind him of why he fell in love with me all those years ago. When he came downstairs at exactly 7:15, like he had every morning for the past decade, hair still messy from sleep and reaching for his coffee mug before his eyes were even fully open, I couldn't contain my excitement and practically bounced on my toes as I served him those golden pancakes with butter melting into every fluffy layer. Happy anniversary, sweetheart, I said, leaning down to kiss his forehead while he read the morning paper. And when he looked up and smiled that crooked smile that still made my knees weak after 3 decades, I felt like the luckiest woman alive. Like we were still that young couple who couldn't keep their hands off each other. He told me about his plans to close the shop early so we could have a proper celebration, how he'd made reservations at Morrison's restaurant for 6 o'clock. The same place where he'd gotten down on one knee 31 years ago with a tiny diamond ring he'd saved for 8 months to buy. And I felt tears of happiness spring to my eyes because it meant he remembered. It meant this day was important to him too. I spent the entire morning humming while I cleaned the house from top to bottom, polishing furniture that was already spotless and arranging fresh flowers in every room because I wanted everything to be picture perfect when we came home from dinner, wanted our house to look like the loving home I'd always tried to create for us. I took extra care getting ready, spending an hour doing my hair in the soft curls that Robert used to say made me look like a movie star, applying the lipstick I'd worn on our wedding day that I'd somehow managed to make last all these years by using it only on the most special occasions, and slipping into that new blue dress I'd bought at Penny's with money I'd saved from my small job at the church office. Standing in front of our bedroom mirror, smoothing down the fabric and adjusting the pearl necklace Robert gave me for our 10th anniversary, I felt beautiful and cherished and so grateful for the life we'd built together. For 30 years of waking up next to the same man who still kissed me goodbye every morning and told me he loved me every night before we turned off the lights. The house felt alive with possibility that day, filled with the kind of anticipation that used to make holidays magical when the children were small. And I remember thinking that this was what happiness looked like, this quiet contentment of a woman who had everything she'd ever really wanted. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon when I decided to surprise Robert by bringing him lunch at the shop, something I hadn't done in months because he'd been so busy and stressed lately. But today, being our anniversary, made me want to do something sweet and unexpected, something that would remind him of the early days when I used to pack him sandwiches with little love notes tucked inside. I made his favorite roast beef sandwich on the thick homemade bread I'd baked that morning, adding extra mustard the way he liked it, and wrapped it carefully in wax paper along with some of my chocolate chip cookies and a thermos of fresh coffee, feeling like a newlywed again as I drove the 10 minutes to Thompson's Auto Repair in our old blue Buick. But when I pulled into the gravel parking lot, Robert's pickup truck wasn't there, which struck me as odd since he'd specifically told me he'd be working all day to finish Mrs. Henderson's transmission before our dinner. And when I walked into the empty garage calling his name, my voice echoing off the concrete walls lined with tools and spare parts, I felt the first flutter of unease in my stomach. Jimmy Rodriguez, the young mechanic Robert had hired last year, poked his head out from under the hood of a red Camaro and told me with an uncomfortable expression that Robert had left around noon, saying he had some errands to run and wouldn't be back until tomorrow, which made no sense because we had dinner reservations in 3 hours and Robert never, ever left work unfinished, especially not on a day as important as today. I drove home with my mind racing, trying to come up with logical explanations while that sandwich sat untouched on the passenger seat beside me, growing cold and somehow symbolic of all the ways I'd been trying to nourish a marriage that was slowly starving to death without my realizing it. When I got home, I noticed Robert's cell phone sitting on the kitchen counter, the phone he never went anywhere without, and something deep in my gut told me to pick it up, even though I'd never invaded his privacy in 30 years of marriage. Never felt the need to, because I trusted him completely and believed that trust was the foundation of everything good between us. The phone wasn't locked because Robert always said he had nothing to hide from me. And when I scrolled through his recent messages with shaking hands that didn't feel like my own anymore, I found conversations with someone named Linda that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins and my knees buckle. So suddenly I had to grab the kitchen counter to keep from falling. Can't wait to see you this afternoon, baby, her message from 2 hours ago read, followed by Robert's response that said, already on my way to you, beautiful. Tonight's going to be difficult with Millie, but tomorrow we can spend the whole day together like we planned. There were dozens of messages going back months, intimate words and plans and promises that belonged to me, that were supposed to be ours, conversations about meeting at some motel on Highway 30 and how much they missed each other and how Robert couldn't wait to finally be free to love her the way she deserved. I stood there in my anniversary dress, holding that phone with trembling hands while the afternoon sunlight streamed through those same lace curtains that had made everything look so perfect that morning, reading message after message that detailed a secret life my husband had been living right under my nose, a parallel universe where he was passionate and romantic and everything he used to be with me, but hadn't been for years. The woman in those messages wasn't just some random fling or momentary mistake. She was someone he made future plans with, someone he called the love of his life, and promised to build a real life with once this anniversary charade is over. And as I read those words, I felt 30 years of my life crumble into dust around my feet. I don't remember dropping the phone, but I must have because suddenly it was on the kitchen floor and the screen was cracked like a spider web, and I was staring at it lying there among the scattered pieces of my shattered life, while my body did things I couldn't control, shaking so violently that my teeth were chattering like I'd been thrown into an ice-cold lake in the middle of winter. My chest felt like someone had reached inside and squeezed my heart with a fist made of broken glass, each breath coming in short. Painful gasps that didn't seem to bring any air to my lungs, and I found myself bent over the kitchen sink, where I'd been so happy just hours before, dry heaving while tears streamed down my face and ruined the careful makeup I'd applied with such hope and excitement. The room started spinning around me like I was on some horrible carnival ride that wouldn't stop, and I had to grip the edge of the counter with both hands to keep from collapsing. My knuckles white and my wedding ring catching the light and mocking me with its promise of forever that had apparently meant nothing to the man who'd placed it on my finger 3 decades ago. I kept thinking this had to be some kind of mistake, some terrible misunderstanding, because the Robert the First knew, the man who still held my hand during scary movies and brought me wildflowers from the roadside just because Tuesday felt like a good day for flowers, couldn't possibly be the same person writing those intimate messages to another woman, planning a future that didn't include me. My mind kept trying to make sense of what I'd read, replaying every conversation we'd had over the past few months, every late night at work, every weekend errand that took longer than it should have, and suddenly all those innocent explanations I'd accepted without question transformed into lies that felt like physical blows to my stomach. I thought about all the times I'd defended him to my sister Margaret when she'd hint that something seemed off, all the times I'd made excuses for his distance and irritability, telling myself and everyone else that he was just working hard to secure our future, never imagining that his future was with someone else entirely. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal itself, though that felt like a knife twisting in my chest, but the realization that I'd been living a lie for who knows how long, that while I was planning anniversary dinners and buying new dresses and believing we were growing old together, he was falling in love with another woman and making plans to leave me behind like yesterday's newspaper. I found myself looking around our kitchen, really seeing it for the first time in years, noticing how everything was exactly the way I'd arranged it, how none of Robert's preferences were reflected in the curtains I'd chosen, or the dishes I'd selected, or the way I'd organized the cabinets. And I wondered if this house had ever really been ours, or if it had just been mine all along while he was merely a visitor passing through on his way to somewhere else. My whole body felt like it was made of paper that someone had soaked in water, fragile and falling apart and completely unable to support the weight of this new reality, and I slid down the kitchen cabinets until I was sitting on the linoleum floor in my beautiful blue anniversary dress, hugging my knees to my chest and rocking back and forth like a child trying to comfort herself. The phone kept buzzing with new messages, probably Linda wondering where he was or Robert making more excuses about why he'd be late. But I couldn't bring myself to look at it again. Couldn't bear to read any more words that would confirm what I already knew, but couldn't quite accept. I sat there on that cold floor for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, letting the pain wash over me in waves that threatened to drown me completely, feeling every single year of my life rearranging itself in my memory as I realized that nothing, absolutely nothing, had been what I thought it was. The woman I'd been that morning, the one who'd hummed while making pancakes and felt grateful for her perfect life, seemed like a stranger now, someone naive and foolish and blind to the most obvious truth in the world. And I didn't know how to be anyone else or what to do with this terrible knowledge that had turned my entire existence inside out in the space of a few devastating minutes. The worst part was how my body seemed to remember things my mind had been ignoring, like how Robert had started showering immediately when he came home instead of sitting down to dinner first, how he'd begun doing his own laundry and taking phone calls outside, how he'd stopped reaching for me in bed and started sleeping on the very edge of the mattress, like I was a stranger he was trying not to touch. I remembered the new cologne I'd smelled on his shirts, expensive, and nothing like the Old Spice he'd worn for decades, and how when I'd asked about it, he'd said Jimmy had spilled something at the shop and he'd borrowed some from the gas station bathroom to cover the smell. Every lie felt like another punch to my already battered heart, and I could feel myself starting to hyperventilate, my vision going dark around the edges while my hands tingled and went numb like I was having some kind of medical emergency. I tried to focus on breathing, counting to 10 the way my mother had taught me during childhood panic attacks, but my mind kept spinning back to those messages, to the casual way he'd called her beautiful and promised her tomorrow, as if I was just an inconvenience to be endured until he could get back to his real life. The house felt different now, like it was mocking me with all the evidence I'd been too trusting to see, and I found myself staring at the anniversary card I'd left on the counter that morning, the one with the sweet message about 30 more years together, and it looked like something written by a completely different person, someone who believed in things like forever and faithfulness and growing old together. I kept thinking about Linda, this woman whose name I'd never heard before today, but who apparently knew intimate details about my marriage, my husband's body, maybe even my daily routines and habits, and I felt violated in a way that went beyond just sexual betrayal. She knew Robert was married, had to know about me, but she pursued him anyway, and that knowledge made me feel naive and stupid and somehow complicit in my own destruction, like I should have seen this coming, should have fought harder for what was mine. The practical part of my brain started cataloging all the signs I'd missed, all the evenings he'd claimed to be working late when the shop phone had gone straight to voicemail, all the weekends he'd suddenly needed to help Jimmy with a big job that somehow never seemed to get finished, all the times he'd been too tired for conversation or intimacy, but somehow had energy to text another woman about love and future plans. I felt like I was drowning in my own naivety, suffocating under the weight of my own blind trust, and I couldn't decide if I was more angry at him for lying or at myself for believing the lies so completely. By 5:30 that evening, I had made a decision that surprised even me, a choice that the old Mildred never would have had the courage to make. But the woman sitting on that kitchen floor in her ruined anniversary dress was someone entirely new, someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by finally standing up for herself. I picked up that broken phone, scrolled through those devastating messages one more time to fuel the fire building in my chest, then walked upstairs to fix my makeup and hair with hands that were suddenly steady as granite, because if Robert wanted to play games on our anniversary, then we were going to finish this charade exactly the way he'd planned it. I reapplied my lipstick with the precision of a woman preparing for war, powdered over the evidence of my tears, and sprayed on the perfume he'd bought me for Christmas, the one he'd said smelled like spring flowers, but probably reminded him of how different I was from his young girlfriend with her cheap drugstore scents. When Robert came home at 5:45, whistling like he didn't have a care in the world and calling out, "Sorry, I'm late. Darling," had some unexpected car trouble to deal with, I met him at the door with a smile so bright it could have powered the entire town, kissing his cheek and telling him how handsome he looked in his good blue shirt, the one I'd ironed that morning before I knew he'd worn it to see another woman. He seemed relieved that I wasn't asking questions about where he'd been, probably thinking he'd dodged a bullet, And during the 20-minute drive to Morrison's restaurant, he chatted about work and the weather and how nice it was to have an evening out together, just the two of us, while I nodded and smiled and planned exactly how I was going to destroy his comfortable little world. Morrison's was crowded with the usual Friday night crowd, families celebrating birthdays and young couples on dates, and the hostess seated us at the same corner table where Robert had proposed 31 years ago. The one with the red checkered tablecloth and the little candle in a wine bottle that had seemed so romantic when we were young and stupid and believed in forever. We ordered our usual. Robert getting the country fried steak he always chose, and me getting the pot roast that reminded me of my mother's cooking. And for the first 20 minutes of dinner, we made small talk about our children and the weather and how good the food was, while I watched him lie effortlessly to my face and wondered how many other times he'd sat across from me wearing that same innocent expression while his mind was on another woman. It wasn't until our coffee arrived, the same bitter brew that had witnessed his proposal 3 decades earlier, that I reached into my purse and placed his cracked phone on the table between us, watching his face change from confusion to recognition to pure panic in the space of about 3 seconds, and said in a voice that was surprisingly calm, "I know about Linda, Robert. I know about all of it." The color drained from his face so fast I thought he might faint right there in front of the Miller family celebrating their daughter's graduation 2 tables over, and he started stammering about how it wasn't what it looked like, how I was misunderstanding something, how he could explain everything if I just give him a chance. But I held up my hand to stop him and said, "Don't you dare insult my intelligence any more than you already have. I read the messages, Robert. All of them. Every single lying, cheating word." He looked around the restaurant like he was hoping the floor would open up and swallow him whole, clearly mortified that we were having this conversation in public where people could see and hear, and he leaned forward to whisper, "Millie, please, not here. We can talk about this at home." But I had no intention of protecting his reputation or sparing his feelings, not after what I discovered. Not after 30 years of putting his comfort before my own truth. "You want to talk about it?" I said, not bothering to lower my voice, feeling a strange sense of power as the couple at the next table started glancing over with obvious curiosity. "Let's talk about how you told her you couldn't wait to be free to love her the way she deserved, or how you called me a charade that you had to endure, or how you've been planning a future with her while I've been planning our retirement together." Robert's face went from white to red as he realized people were definitely listening now, and he reached across the table to grab my hand, probably hoping to salvage some dignity. But I pulled away like his touch burned me and continued. "I want to know how long it's been going on, Robert. I want to know if you were thinking about her when you kissed me this morning and told me happy anniversary. If you were planning to sneak away to see her while I was here waiting for you like a fool." He tried again to quiet me, his voice desperate and pleading as he said my name over and over like it was some kind of prayer that could undo the damage. But 30 years of being the good wife, the understanding wife, the wife who never made scenes or asked uncomfortable questions, had just died on that kitchen floor a few hours earlier, and the woman sitting across from him now had no patience for his embarrassment or his excuses. "Answer me," I demanded, loud enough now that our waitress was hovering nearby pretending to wipe down empty tables, while obviously eavesdropping on the most dramatic thing to happen at Morrison's since the health inspector found mice in the kitchen 3 years ago. "How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been making a fool of me while I cooked your meals and washed your clothes and believed every word that came out of your mouth?" Robert finally found his voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper, and he said, 18 months, Millie. "It's been 18 months, but it's not what you think. It just happened. We didn't plan it, and I never meant for you to find out like this. I was going to tell you. I swear I was going to tell you." The confession hit me like a physical blow. 18 months of lies and deception while I'd been living in a fantasy world where my marriage was solid and my husband loved me, and I felt that familiar rage building in my chest. But this time, instead of breaking down, I felt myself getting stronger, angrier, more powerful than I'd ever felt in my entire life. 18 months, I repeated, letting those words hang in the air between us like a death sentence. Watching Robert squirm in his chair while the reality of his confession settled over our table like a toxic cloud that made everything around us seem suddenly surreal and distant. 18 months of coming home to me every night, eating the dinner I cooked, sleeping in the bed we've shared for 30 years, while you were in love with another woman, planning a life with her, promising her things that belonged to me. Robert started talking then, words pouring out of him like water from a broken dam, telling me how it had started innocently enough when Linda brought her car to the shop, how she was going through a divorce and just needed someone to talk to, how they'd started having coffee and then lunch, and how one thing just led to another, like he was describing some natural disaster that had happened to him rather than choices he'd made deliberately, repeatedly, for a year and a half. He kept using phrases like, I never meant for this to happen, and it just got out of hand, and I was going to end it, I swear I was, but every excuse felt like another slap across my face, another insult to the intelligence he'd apparently been underestimating for decades. The worst part was learning the details I hadn't wanted to know but couldn't stop myself from demanding, like how Linda was 38 years old, worked as a secretary at the county courthouse, had two teenage children from her failed marriage, and apparently thought Robert was going to divorce me and marry her once the time was right, whatever that meant. She knows about me, I said, and it wasn't a question because the answer was written all over his guilty face, and when he nodded miserably and admitted that yes, Linda knew he was married, knew about our anniversary, knew about our children and our life together, but had fallen in love with him anyway. I felt something inside me break that would never be repaired. Robert tried to convince me that he'd been planning to tell me after our anniversary, that he couldn't bear to ruin this special day, but had been working up the courage to ask for a divorce, and the casual way he said that word, divorce, like it was just another item on his to-do list between getting the oil changed and fixing the kitchen faucet, made me realize that he'd been living in a completely different reality than I had. One where our marriage was already over, and I just hadn't been informed yet. You were planning to divorce me, I said slowly, testing the words in my mouth like they were poison. And he had the nerve to look hurt, like I was being unreasonable for being upset about his secret plans to dismantle our entire life together. I didn't want to hurt you, Millie, he said, reaching for my hand again. But I jerked away like he was on fire, because his touch felt like a lie now. Every caress and kiss and gentle gesture from the past 18 months suddenly revealed as acts of deception rather than love. I thought about all the times I'd worried about him working late, all the nights I'd kept his dinner warm in the oven and fallen asleep waiting for him to come home, all the mornings I'd packed his lunch with little notes saying, I love you. While he was probably thinking about another woman, planning his escape from the marriage I thought we were both committed to preserving. The people around us had stopped pretending not to listen and were openly staring now, some with sympathy, others with the kind of morbid fascination people have for car accidents and natural disasters. And I realized that our private tragedy had become public entertainment, that tomorrow half the town would know that Robert Thompson had been cheating on his wife, and she'd found out on their 30th anniversary. Does she make you feel young again? I asked, surprising myself with the steadiness of my voice, and Robert looked confused by the question, like he'd expected me to scream or cry or make a scene that would give him an excuse to paint me as the hysterical wife who couldn't handle the truth like a mature adult. Does she make you feel like the man you used to be, before you got stuck with a boring old wife who doesn't understand you? I continued, watching his face change as he realized I wasn't going to fall apart the way he'd probably expected, wasn't going to beg him to stay or promise to change, or do any of the things that might have made this easier for him to bear. The truth was starting to dawn on him that I wasn't just discovering his affair, I was discovering him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in our entire marriage, recognizing him as someone capable of cruelty and selfishness and deception on a scale I'd never imagined possible from the man who'd promised to love and cherish me until death do us part. She's young enough to be your daughter, Robert, I said, feeling a strange calm settle over me like armor, protecting me from the worst of the pain while I processed what came next, what I was going to do with this information that had just blown up my entire existence. She's young enough to be our daughter, and you're old enough to be her father, and you think that makes you feel alive again. But all it really makes you is pathetic. That comment hit him like I'd slapped him across the face, and for the first time since I'd put his phone on the table, Robert looked genuinely angry instead of just guilty and embarrassed, his jaw tightening and his eyes flashing with the kind of defensive rage that men get when someone tells them a truth they don't want to hear about themselves. It's not like that, Millie, he said through gritted teeth, leaning forward and lowering his voice to a harsh whisper. And you don't know anything about what I've been going through, how lonely I've been, how long it's been since you and I really connected about anything that mattered. Now, he was trying to turn this around on me, make me somehow responsible for his decision to betray our marriage vows. And I felt a laugh bubble up from somewhere deep in my chest, a sound so bitter and harsh that it didn't sound like it came from me at all. So this is my fault, I asked, loud enough that the young couple at the table behind us turned to stare openly, their own romantic dinner forgotten in favor of our spectacular public breakdown. I'm the reason you decided to lie to me for 18 months and plan a future with another woman? Robert's face flushed even redder as he realized that every word out of his mouth was just digging him deeper into a hole he'd never be able to climb out of, and I could see him calculating whether he could somehow salvage this situation, whether there was any combination of words that might convince me to forgive him and go back to the comfortable lie we'd been living. I never wanted to hurt you, he repeated, but the words sounded hollow now, like something he'd practiced saying in front of a mirror. And when he added, maybe we could try counseling, maybe we could work through this, I actually laughed out loud, a sound so sharp and bitter that our waitress jumped and nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. Work through this, I repeated, shaking my head in amazement at his audacity. You want to work through 18 months of lies and betrayal and planning to divorce me so you can be with your girlfriend? You want to work through the fact that while I was planning our future, you were planning to abandon me for a woman young enough to be our child. The fight seemed to go out of him then, his shoulders sagging as he finally understood that there would be no easy fix for this, no way to charm or manipulate or convince me that what he'd done was somehow forgivable, and he looked around the restaurant one more time before meeting my eyes and saying quietly, "What do you want me to do, Millie? What do you want me to say?" It was the first honest question he'd asked all evening, maybe the first honest thing he'd said to me in 18 months. And I realized that I didn't want him to do anything or say anything because nothing he could do or say would ever undo the damage he'd done to my heart, my trust, my faith in everything I'd believed about love and marriage and the kind of man I'd chosen to spend my life with. I want you to finish your dinner, I said, standing up from the table and pulling on my coat while the entire restaurant watched in fascination. And then I want you to go to Linda's house and tell her that your wife knows everything and that you're finally free to be together. Because I'm done pretending that this marriage means anything to either one of us. I walked out of Morrison's restaurant with my head held high and my back straight, leaving Robert sitting there with his mouth hanging open and his unfinished country fried steak getting cold on his plate, while every person in that dining room watched me stride toward the door like I was walking toward my freedom instead of away from the only life I'd ever known. The evening air hit my face like a blessing, cool and clean and somehow lighter than the suffocating atmosphere I'd been breathing for the past hour. And I stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking up at the stars that seemed brighter than they had in years, feeling something I hadn't felt in decades, something that took me a minute to recognize as power, real power, the kind that comes from finally telling the truth and refusing to live a lie anymore. I drove home slowly, not because I was afraid or uncertain about what came next, but because I wanted to savor this feeling of clarity, this strange sense of relief that comes when the worst thing you can imagine finally happens and you realize you're strong enough to survive it, maybe even strong enough to build something better from the wreckage. When I pulled into our driveway and saw our little house with its yellow porch light and the garden I'd tended for 28 years, I felt a brief moment of sadness for the woman I'd been that morning, the one who'd believed in forever and thought she had everything she wanted. But that sadness was quickly replaced by a fierce determination to become someone entirely new. Someone who would never again make herself small for a man who didn't deserve her devotion. I walked through our front door, past the anniversary flowers I'd arranged so carefully, past the wedding china still sitting on the table from our breakfast that seemed like it had happened in another lifetime, and straight upstairs to our bedroom where I pulled out the old suitcase we'd used for our honeymoon trip to Branson 30 years ago. I packed methodically, taking only the things that were truly mine, the clothes Robert had never noticed or complimented, the jewelry my mother had given me, the books I'd read during all those lonely evenings when he was supposedly working late, but was actually building a life with another woman. And as I folded each item and placed it carefully in that worn leather case, I felt pieces of my old self falling away like dead leaves from a tree preparing for new growth. I left behind the anniversary gifts he'd given me over the years, the perfume he'd chosen because it reminded him of spring flowers, the nightgowns he bought hoping to rekindle something that had apparently died for him long before he found Linda, and it felt like shedding a skin that had never quite fit right anyway, like stepping out of clothes that belonged to someone else entirely. From our joint savings account, I took exactly half of what we'd saved together, down to the penny, not because I was being vindictive, but because I was being fair, taking only what I'd earned through 30 years of being a devoted wife and partner, leaving him the rest to start his new life with his young girlfriend, who probably had no idea what she was really getting herself into. I wrote him a letter on the same stationery I'd used for thank you notes and birthday cards and all the other gentle, wifely communications that had been my specialty for 3 decades. But the words I wrote that night were unlike anything I'd ever put on paper before. Clear and direct and absolutely final. Robert, I wrote, I am leaving tonight and I will not be back. You can explain to Linda and to our children and to anyone else who asks that you got exactly what you wanted, which is freedom from a marriage you clearly stopped valuing long before you found the courage to tell me so. I am not angry anymore, because anger is what you feel when someone disappoints you, and you can only be disappointed by someone you still have expectations of. I have no expectations of you anymore, which means I am finally, truly free. I left the letter on his pillow, next to the wedding ring I'd worn for 30 years and had removed without a moment's hesitation, feeling lighter with each step as I carried my suitcase downstairs and loaded it into the car that was now mine alone. Mine to drive wherever I wanted to go, whenever I wanted to go there. I had no plan beyond getting in that car and driving away from the life I'd thought I wanted toward whatever was waiting for me out there in the darkness. And for the first time in my adult life, that uncertainty felt like possibility instead of fear. At 72 years old, sitting in my car in the driveway of the house where I'd spent the best and worst years of my life, I realized that I had no idea who Mildred Thompson was when she wasn't being Robert's wife, but I was finally going to find out, and that discovery felt like the greatest adventure I'd ever embarked upon. I drove aimlessly through the dark streets of Cedar Falls for almost an hour before the practical reality of my situation finally hit me like a cold slap across the face. The realization that I was a 72-year-old woman with nowhere to go and no plan beyond escaping the wreckage of my marriage. Suddenly feeling very small and very alone in a world that wasn't designed for women like me who had spent their entire adult lives being someone's wife and mother instead of learning how to be independent. Every motel I passed looked either too expensive for my limited budget or too dangerous for an elderly woman traveling alone. And I found myself circling the same blocks over and over, seeing my town through new eyes that noticed things I'd never paid attention to before, like how many businesses were closed and boarded up, how many streetlights were broken, how few options there really were for someone starting over from scratch. I finally pulled into the parking lot of the Sleepy Inn on Highway 30, the same rundown motel where Robert had apparently been meeting Linda for 18 months, and sat in my car staring at the flashing neon sign that advertised hourly rates and cable TV, wondering if this was what freedom looked like, if this was the independence I'd been so eager to claim just an hour earlier. The night clerk was a young man with multiple piercings and tattoos covering his arms, and he looked at me with obvious curiosity when I walked in carrying my old suitcase and asked for a room for the night, probably wondering what a grandmother was doing checking into a place like this alone at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. The room was exactly what I'd expected, small and shabby with thin walls and a carpet that had seen better decades. But it was clean enough, and it was mine, and I sat on the edge of the scratchy bedspread feeling simultaneously terrified and exhilarated by the strangeness of being in a place where Robert had never been, where no one expected me to cook dinner or do laundry, or pretend to be happy about a life that had been slowly suffocating me for years. But as the adrenaline of my dramatic exit began to wear off, the practical problems started mounting in my mind like storm clouds on the horizon. Problems I'd been too angry and too hurt to consider when I was packing my suitcase and writing my farewell letter. I had enough money to last maybe 6 months if I was careful. But at my age, who was going to hire me for anything more than minimum wage work that would barely cover rent on even the cheapest apartment? I'd never lived alone in my entire life, had gone straight from my father's house to married life with Robert, and I suddenly realized I didn't know how to do things like negotiate with landlords or get utilities turned on in my name, or even how to eat dinner by myself without feeling like a failure. My children would have to be told, And I dreaded that conversation more than almost anything else, knowing that Sarah would want to fix everything and make peace between her parents. While Michael would probably be angry at both of us for disrupting the stable family foundation he'd always taken for granted. I thought about my sister Margaret, who lived 3 hours away in Des Moines and had been warning me for years that something wasn't right with Robert, and I wondered if I was strong enough to call her and admit that she'd been right all along, that I'd been blind and naive and completely fooled by a man I'd trusted with my entire life. The silence in that motel room was deafening, not the comfortable quiet of a house I'd made into a home, but the hollow emptiness of a place where no one knew my name or cared whether I lived or died. And for the first time since I discovered Robert's betrayal, I felt truly afraid, not of him or of being alone, but of the possibility that I was too old and too set in my ways to build a new life from nothing. I lay on that lumpy mattress in my clothes, staring at the water-stained ceiling and listening to the sounds of other people's lives filtering through the thin walls, conversations and television programs, and intimate moments that reminded me how isolated I'd become in the space of a single day. How completely unprepared I was for the practical realities of independence at an age when most women my age were surrounded by grandchildren and retirement plans and the comfortable routines of a life well lived. The doubts crept in like shadows, whispering that maybe I'd been too hasty, too dramatic, that maybe I should have tried harder to work things out with Robert, accepted his affair as the price of staying married, and avoided the terrifying uncertainty of starting over when I was closer to the end of my life than the beginning. But then I remembered the look on Robert's face when I'd placed that broken phone on the restaurant table, the panic and guilt and sudden realization that his comfortable double life had just exploded in the most public way possible, and I felt that spark of fierce satisfaction again. The knowledge that at least I'd stopped being a victim and started being someone who fought back against betrayal and lies. I got up from the bed and walked to the small window that looked out over the parking lot, watching other travelers come and go with their own stories and problems and destinations, and I realized that for the first time in 30 years, I had no idea what tomorrow would bring. And that uncertainty was both the most terrifying and the most liberating feeling I'd ever experienced. My phone had been buzzing all evening with calls and text messages from Robert, probably desperate to explain himself or convince me to come home so we could work things out like civilized adults. But I turned it off hours ago because I had no interest in hearing his voice or his excuses or his promises to do better if I just give him another chance. The silence was mine now, the space to think and feel and plan without having to consider his needs or his feelings or his version of what our life together had been. And I found myself taking deep breaths for what felt like the first time in years, no longer holding myself small and quiet to avoid disturbing the peace of a man who had been systematically destroying that peace behind my back. I thought about all the dreams I'd given up to support his dreams, all the times I'd made myself smaller to make him feel bigger, all the years I'd spent believing that a good wife was one who never complained or demanded too much or expected her husband to actually prioritize her happiness above his own convenience. The woman I'd been that morning seemed like someone from another lifetime, someone who had accepted crumbs and called them a feast, who had mistaken loneliness for contentment and emotional neglect for mature love. And I felt a strange kind of grief for her, for all the years she'd wasted waiting for a man to love her the way she deserved to be loved. But alongside that grief was something else, something that felt like hunger, not for food, but for experience, for the chance to find out who I could be when I wasn't constantly trying to be the perfect wife to a man who had already chosen someone else. I had no idea what I was going to do about money or housing or the 100 other practical problems that would need solving in the coming days and weeks. But for the first time in my adult life, those were my problems to solve, my decisions to make, my future to create without having to consider anyone else's preferences or limitations. The fear was still there, cold and sharp in my chest, but it was competing now with something that felt like excitement, the kind of anticipatory energy I hadn't felt since I was young, and everything seemed possible, when the world stretched out ahead of me like an unmapped territory waiting to be explored. I sat down at the small table by the window and took out a piece of paper from my purse, the same kind I'd used to write grocery lists and notes for the children's teachers, but instead of writing someone else's needs, I started making a list of my own. Things I wanted to do and see and experience now that I was free to make choices based on what I wanted instead of what was expected of me. The list started small, practical things like finding an apartment and looking for work. But as I continued writing, it grew bolder, including things like taking a photography class, learning to use a computer, maybe even traveling somewhere I'd always wanted to go, but never could because Robert didn't like to leave his routine or spend money on what he called frivolous things. I wrote until my hand cramped and the paper was covered with possibilities, and when I finally looked up, the first pale light of dawn was creeping across the parking lot, and I realized I'd spent the entire night planning a future that belonged entirely to me. A life where my happiness mattered as much as anyone else's, where my dreams were worth pursuing even if I was starting 40 years later than most people. It wasn't going to be easy, and there would be days when I'd probably regret leaving the security of a marriage that was familiar, even if it was fundamentally dishonest. But sitting in that shabby motel room with my list of possibilities and the morning sun painting everything gold, I felt more alive and more hopeful than I'd felt in decades, like I was finally ready to become the woman I was meant to be all along. I was sitting in the motel parking lot the next morning, drinking terrible coffee from a paper cup and watching the sun rise over Cedar Falls for what I thought might be the last time, when Robert's pickup truck pulled into the space next to my car, and I felt my stomach drop like I was on a roller coaster that had just plunged over its highest peak. He looked like he hadn't slept all night, his hair disheveled and his shirt wrinkled, and when he got out of his truck and walked toward me with that expression of desperate determination I'd seen 1,000 times before when he was trying to fix something that was beyond repair, I knew he'd come to try to convince me to give up this foolish independence and come home where I belonged. Millie, he said, and his voice was hoarse with exhaustion and what might have been tears, though I'd only seen Robert cry twice in 30 years, once when his father died, and once when our son broke his arm falling out of the old oak tree in our backyard. Please, we need to talk about this. We need to figure out how to fix what's been broken. I looked at him standing there in the morning light. This man I'd loved with every fiber of my being for 3 decades, and I felt something that surprised me. Not anger or hurt or even sadness, but a kind of detached clarity that made me see him exactly as he was, not as the hero of my romantic fantasies or the villain of my betrayal story, but as a deeply flawed human being who had made choices that destroyed our marriage and was now facing consequences he'd never bothered to consider. There's nothing to fix, Robert, I said, and my voice was steadier than I'd expected it to be, calm in a way that seemed to unnerve him more than screaming would have. Because you can't fix 18 months of lies and betrayal and planning to leave me for another woman. You can't apologize your way back to trust that took 30 years to build and 5 minutes to destroy completely. He started talking then, the same desperate stream of excuses and explanations I'd heard at the restaurant, telling me how sorry he was, how it had all been a mistake, how Linda meant nothing to him compared to what we had together. And I listened with the kind of patience you show a child who's trying to explain why they broke something valuable, knowing that no explanation could possibly make the damage acceptable. I called Linda last night, he said, and I could see how much it cost him to admit this. I told her it was over, that I was staying with you, that we were going to work through this and save our marriage, and he said it like he expected me to be grateful, like his decision to end his affair was some kind of gift he was giving me rather than the bare minimum of what any decent husband should have done 18 months ago. You told her you were staying with me, I repeated slowly, feeling that familiar anger start to build in my chest, not the hot, explosive rage I'd felt at the restaurant, but something colder and more dangerous, the kind of fury that comes from being completely and utterly underestimated by someone who should know you better than anyone else in the world. You decided, all by yourself, that we were going to work through this, without asking me what I wanted or whether I had any interest in staying married to a man who spent the last year and a half building a life with another woman while lying to my face every single day. Robert looked confused by my response, like he'd expected me to be relieved that he'd chosen me over his girlfriend, and I realized that even now, even after everything that had happened, he still didn't understand that the problem wasn't just the affair itself, but the complete lack of respect and consideration he'd shown me throughout our entire marriage. The way he'd made major decisions about our life together without ever consulting me or caring about my feelings. I love you, Millie, he said, and for the first time since this nightmare began, his voice broke completely, tears streaming down his face as he reached for my hands. I've always loved you, and I know I screwed up, I know I hurt you, but we can get past this. We can go to counseling, we can make this work if you'll just give me another chance. I looked down at his hands holding mine, Hands that had touched another woman intimately while wearing the wedding ring I'd placed on his finger 30 years ago. Hands that had written love letters to someone else while I was at home cooking his dinner and washing his clothes and believing in the sanctity of our marriage vows. And I felt the last vestiges of my old self. The woman who had always tried to fix things and make peace and put everyone else's needs before her own. Finally, and completely die. You don't love me, Robert, I said, pulling my hands free and standing up so I could look down at him where he was kneeling beside my chair like a penitent seeking absolution. You love the idea of me. You love having someone to take care of you and support your dreams and make your life comfortable. But you don't love me as a person with my own needs and desires and the right to expect fidelity from my husband. I could see him getting frustrated now. That familiar flash of irritation that appeared whenever I said something that challenged his version of reality. And he stood up and said, "That's not fair, Millie. You know I love you. You know our marriage has meant everything to me, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to prove that to you." But I was done being told what I knew and what I should think and how I should react to being betrayed by the man who had promised to love and honor me until death do us part. And I felt a power rising in me that I'd never accessed before. The power that comes from finally, truly not caring whether someone likes what you have to say. Our marriage hasn't meant everything to you, I said, and my voice was clear and strong and absolutely certain, because if it had, you never would have risked it for 18 months of excitement with a woman who doesn't know you well enough to realize that she's dating a man who's capable of lying to his wife's face for a year and a half without feeling guilty enough to confess. Robert's face went white, then red, then white again. And I could see him struggling between the urge to argue with me and the dawning realization that nothing he said was going to change my mind, that the woman standing in front of him was not the same person who had made him pancakes and kissed him goodbye just 2 days ago. "What do you want me to do?" he asked finally. And there was something desperate and lost in his voice that might have moved me once, but I was beyond being moved by his pain when he had caused so much of mine without a second thought. "I want you to go back to Linda," I said, and I could see the shock on his face as he realized I was serious. "I want you to tell her that your wife has given you exactly what you both wanted, which is freedom to be together without having to sneak around or lie, or pretend that what you were doing was anything other than a deliberate choice to destroy a marriage that someone else had spent 30 years believing in." I walked to my car then, and Robert followed me, still talking, still trying to convince me that we could somehow salvage something from the wreckage of our life together. But I was no longer listening to his words, only to the sound of my own heartbeat, steady and strong and completely my own for the first time in my adult life. I got in my car and drove away from that motel parking lot without looking back, leaving Robert standing there among the scattered pieces of his comfortable illusions. And for the first time in 30 years, I felt like I was driving towards something instead of away from something. Like every mile I put between us was a mile closer to whoever I was meant to become. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel, not from fear or uncertainty, but from the sheer adrenaline of having finally said everything I'd needed to say, of having looked the man who'd betrayed me in the eye and refused to accept his excuses or his version of what our future should look like. I drove straight to the First National Bank, where we'd had our joint account since 1994, and I walked in with my head high and my shoulders back, telling the bank manager that I needed to open my own checking account and close the joint savings we'd shared, taking exactly half of everything we'd accumulated together and leaving Robert to figure out his own financial future with Linda. The process took less than an hour, but it felt like the most important business transaction of my entire life. The moment when I stopped being Robert's wife and started being Mildred Thompson, an independent woman with her own money and her own choices and her own power to determine what came next. From the bank, I drove to the Cedar Falls Public Library, a place I'd visited countless times to check out romance novels and self-help books, but never with the purpose I had today, which was to use their computers to search for apartment rentals and job openings and all the practical necessities of building a life from scratch at 72 years old. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, whose car Robert had been fixing just the day before I discovered his affair, looked at me with obvious curiosity when I asked for help using the internet, probably wondering why Robert Thompson's wife was suddenly interested in learning computer skills and looking at classified ads. I spent 3 hours at that computer, printing out apartment listings and job postings and information about social services for senior citizens. feeling simultaneously overwhelmed by all the details I'd need to manage, and excited by the possibilities that were opening up before me like doors I'd never known existed. By the time I left the library, I had appointments to see two apartments the next day, applications for three different part time jobs that might actually hire someone my age, and a phone number for a legal aid society that could help me navigate the divorce process. I was finally ready to begin. I called my sister Margaret from the payphone outside the library, and when she answered on the second ring with her usual cheerful, "Hello, sweetie," I said, "Margaret, it's Millie, and I need to ask you a huge favor," then told her the entire story in one long, breathless confession that left us both crying and laughing at the same time. She didn't ask questions or offer advice or try to talk me into giving Robert another chance. She just said, "Pack your things and drive to Des Moines tonight. You can stay with me as long as you need to, and we'll figure out the rest tomorrow." And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I wasn't completely alone in the world. I drove back to my house one last time, not to reconcile or collect more belongings, but to leave the divorce papers I'd picked up from the courthouse on my way home, papers that would make our separation official and legal and final. And as I placed them on the kitchen table next to the wilted anniversary flowers, I felt a sense of completion that was both heartbreaking and liberating. Robert's truck was in the driveway, but I didn't go inside to talk to him or explain my decision because there was nothing left to say and no part of me that wanted to see his face or hear his voice or give him another opportunity to try to change my mind about something I'd never been more certain of in my entire life. The guest bedroom at Margaret's house in Des Moines became my sanctuary for the next 3 months. A small blue room with white lace curtains and a view of her flower garden that reminded me every morning that beautiful things could grow from nothing if they were tended with care and patience and love. Margaret never asked how long I planned to stay or made me feel like a burden. She just cleared out her sewing supplies and set up a small desk by the window where I could sit with my morning coffee and plan my new life one careful step at a time. The first few weeks were the hardest, not because of grief or regret, but because I kept reaching for routines that no longer existed, waking up at 5:30 to make breakfast for a husband who wasn't there, buying groceries for two people out of habit, feeling phantom pain in the empty spaces where my old life used to be. But slowly, incrementally, I began to fill those spaces with things that belonged entirely to me, starting with small acts of rebellion like sleeping until 8 o'clock, because I'd never been a morning person anyway, drinking my coffee black, because I actually preferred it that way, reading mystery novels instead of the romance books that now seem laughably naive with their promises of true love and happy endings. I got my first job in 28 years at the Hy-Vee grocery store, working part-time as a cashier for minimum wage. And though some people might have seen it as a step down for a woman my age, I felt proud every time I put on that red vest and name tag that said Mildred instead of Mrs. Thompson, proud to be earning my own money and learning new skills and proving to myself that I was capable of more than I'd ever imagined. My hand shook the first day I used the electronic cash register, intimidated by all the buttons and screens that seemed designed for people half my age. But Mrs. Garcia, the assistant manager, who was younger than my own daughter, was patient and kind and never made me feel stupid for asking the same questions twice. The customers were mostly kind, too, especially the elderly ones who seemed to recognize something familiar in my careful competence and gentle manner. And I found myself looking forward to the regular shoppers who would specifically choose my checkout line and ask about my day like I was a person worth knowing instead of just a service they were purchasing. I started taking evening walks through Margaret's neighborhood, something I'd never done in Cedar Falls because Robert always said it wasn't safe for women to walk alone after dark. And I discovered that I loved the quiet streets and the friendly neighbors who waved from their porches and the sense of freedom that came from going wherever I wanted to go without having to explain myself to anyone. Margaret and I fell into an easy routine of cooking dinner together and watching old movies on her television, sharing stories about our childhood and our dreams, and the ways our lives had turned out so differently than we'd planned when we were young and believed that love was enough to solve any problem. She never said, "I told you so" about Robert, even though she'd been warning me for years that something wasn't right about his increasing distance and secretiveness, and she never pushed me to talk about my feelings or my plans beyond what I was ready to share. Instead, she just created space for me to heal at my own pace, surrounding me with the kind of unconditional support I'd forgotten existed. The kind of love that didn't come with expectations or conditions or the need to be grateful for scraps of attention. I started seeing a counselor named Dr. Sarah Chin, a woman about my daughter's age who specialized in helping older adults navigate major life transitions. And in her small office with its plants and soft lighting, I began to understand that what had happened to me wasn't just about Robert's betrayal, but about 30 years of making myself small and invisible and acceptable, of believing that my worth was tied to how well I could anticipate and meet someone else's needs. Dr. Chin taught me words like codependency and emotional neglect that helped me understand that my marriage had been unhealthy long before Robert started his affair, that I'd been starving for emotional intimacy and real partnership while convincing myself that loneliness was just what mature love looked like. She gave me exercises to help me identify my own wants and needs, things I'd stopped paying attention to so long ago that I'd forgotten they existed, and slowly, carefully, I began to reconnect with parts of myself that had been buried under decades of being someone else's wife and mother and support system. 6 months after I walked out of Morrison's restaurant and left my old life scattered on that red checkered tablecloth, like broken dishes, I looked in the mirror of my new studio apartment on Maple Avenue and saw someone I'd never met before, a woman with silver hair that I'd stopped dyeing because I liked the way it caught the light, wearing clothes I'd chosen because they made me feel confident instead of invisible, and most surprisingly, smiling at her own reflection like she actually enjoyed her own company. The apartment was small, but it was mine, every piece of furniture chosen by me for me. From the bright yellow chair where I drank my morning coffee to the bookshelf filled with mysteries and biographies, and even a cookbook for one person. Because I discovered that cooking for myself was an act of self-love I'd never experienced when I was always focused on feeding someone else. I'd been promoted to head cashier at Hy-Vee, and though it wasn't a career that would make me rich, it was work that mattered to me, helping people with their daily needs and building relationships with customers who knew my name and trusted me to handle their groceries with care. And for the first time in my adult life, I understood what it felt like to be valued for my own contributions rather than my ability to support someone else's ambitions. The divorce had been finalized 3 weeks earlier, a surprisingly simple process once I'd made peace with the fact that I didn't want anything from Robert except my freedom and half of what we'd built together during our marriage. And when the judge declared us legally separated, I felt nothing but relief and a strange kind of gratitude that the lie was finally over. Robert had married Linda 2 months after our divorce was final, in a small ceremony at the courthouse that I heard about through the inevitable small town gossip network. And instead of feeling hurt or jealous, I found myself genuinely hoping that they would be happy together and that he would treat her better than he'd treated me. Though I suspected that anyone who would marry a man she'd known was capable of 18 months of systematic deception was probably in for some unpleasant surprises. My children had handled the divorce better than I'd expected. Once they got past their initial shock and disappointment and began to understand that their mother was happier living alone than she'd been in years of pretending to be content in a marriage that had slowly suffocated her spirit. Sarah visited me every few weeks, bringing her own children to see their grandmother's new life, and I loved watching them explore my small apartment and play in the community garden where I'd started growing tomatoes and herbs, teaching them that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the hardest ground. Michael had been angry at first, particularly at Robert, but he'd gradually come to respect my decision and even told me he was proud of me for having the courage to start over at an age when most people just accept whatever life has handed them. I'd started taking art classes at the community college, something I'd always wanted to do, but never had time for when I was busy being the perfect wife. And I discovered that I had a talent for watercolor painting that brought me joy in a way I hadn't experienced since I was a child, making pictures with crayons on construction paper. The teacher, a woman named Patricia who was about my age and had also divorced later in life, became a close friend, and we often painted together on weekends, sharing stories about the surprising gifts that could emerge from life's most devastating losses. I'd learned to use a computer well enough to write emails to my grandchildren and even started a small blog about starting over in your 70s, sharing my experiences with other women who found themselves suddenly single after decades of marriage, and the responses I received from readers all over the country reminded me that my story wasn't unique, that there were thousands of women my age discovering their own strength and independence for the first time. The woman I'd become was someone I genuinely liked, Someone who spoke up for herself and made decisions based on her own values and desires. Someone who could eat dinner alone in a restaurant without feeling like a failure or go to a movie by herself without apologizing to anyone for her choices. I'd stopped waiting for permission to live my life and started creating the kind of existence that reflected who I really was underneath all those years of trying to be who I thought I should be. And the freedom was intoxicating in the best possible way. Like finally being able to breathe deeply after decades of holding my breath. 1 year to the day after I discovered Robert's affair, I woke up in my sunny studio apartment not to the sound of an alarm clock demanding I start someone else's day, but to the gentle chirping of birds outside my window and the knowledge that every hour ahead belonged entirely to me, to fill with work that I enjoyed and people who valued me and activities that brought me genuine pleasure instead of obligation. I made my coffee slowly and deliberately, standing at my kitchen window in my favorite blue robe, the one I'd bought for myself last month because it made me feel elegant instead of invisible, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed more vibrant than any sunrise I could remember from my married life. There was no anniversary to dread today, no need to pretend that a relationship built on lies and emotional neglect was worth celebrating. Just another beautiful morning in a life that had become authentically mine in ways I'd never imagined possible when I was trapped in a marriage that was slowly erasing my sense of self. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a woman who looked older, but somehow more alive than the person who'd stood in Robert's kitchen exactly 1 year ago, making pancakes for a husband who was secretly planning to abandon her for someone else. And I felt a moment of profound gratitude for that devastating discovery that had forced me to finally wake up and claim my own life. The phone rang while I was getting dressed for work, and instead of Robert's voice demanding to know where his clean shirts were or what I was planning for dinner, it was Patricia calling to confirm our plans to drive to the art fair in Iowa City this weekend. Our voices bright with excitement about seeing new artists and maybe buying a painting for my apartment. The kind of spontaneous adventure that had been impossible when I was always worried about disrupting someone else's routine. I drove to work listening to music I actually enjoyed instead of the talk radio stations Robert had always preferred, singing along to songs that made me feel young and hopeful and grateful to be alive in my own skin. And when I arrived at Hy-Vee, my coworkers greeted me with the warmth and respect that came from genuinely caring about each other instead of just tolerating each other's presence. Mrs. Patterson, one of my regular customers, told me I looked happy today, and I realized she was right, that the contentment I felt wasn't the desperate gratitude of someone settling for crumbs, but the deep satisfaction of someone who had built a life that reflected her true values and desires, someone who had learned that happiness wasn't something you waited for someone else to give you, but something you created for yourself through courage and self-respect. During my lunch break, I called my granddaughter Emma to confirm our weekend plans to visit the botanical garden together, just the two of us. And when she told me she was proud of her grandmother for being so brave and independent, I felt tears of joy spring to my eyes because I was finally the kind of woman I wanted my granddaughters to become, someone who knew her own worth and refused to accept anything less than she deserved. That evening, as I sat in my yellow chair reading a mystery novel with a cup of tea and my cat Whiskers purring on my lap, I thought about the woman I'd been exactly 1 year ago, making elaborate plans for an anniversary dinner with a man who was secretly planning to leave her for another woman. And I felt nothing but compassion for her and gratitude for the journey that had brought me to this moment of perfect, peaceful solitude. The life I was living now wasn't the one I'd planned or expected, but it was real and honest and entirely my own, and that made it more precious than any fairy tale ending I could have imagined. If you're listening to this story and recognizing yourself in the woman I used to be, the one who made excuses for her husband's distance, who accepted loneliness as the price of being married, who believed that keeping the peace was more important than keeping her dignity, I want you to know that it's never too late to choose yourself, never too late to demand the love and respect you deserve, never too late to walk away from a life that's slowly killing your spirit, even if everyone else thinks you should be grateful for what you have. The truth that took me 72 years to learn is that there's no virtue in staying small to make someone else comfortable, no honor in accepting betrayal to avoid the inconvenience of starting over, no wisdom in sacrificing your authentic self on the altar of someone else's convenience and calling it love. I know that leaving feels impossible when you've spent decades building a life with someone, when your identity is so wrapped up in being their wife that you can't imagine who you'd be without them. When everyone tells you that marriage is about forgiveness and compromise and making things work no matter what. But I'm here to tell you that some things can't be fixed, and some people don't deserve your forgiveness, and some compromises cost you everything that makes you who you are. The woman I am today, living alone in my small apartment with my books and my art and my cat and my independence, is happier and more at peace than I ever was in 30 years of marriage to a man who took my devotion for granted and repaid my loyalty with lies and betrayal. I'm not telling you this story to make you feel sorry for me or to convince you that all men are terrible or that marriage is doomed to fail. I'm telling you this story because I want every woman who hears it to know that you have choices, you have power, you have worth that exists independent of whether someone else recognizes it. And you deserve a life that honors the magnificent, irreplaceable person you are. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to refuse to accept anything less than you deserve, even if it means starting over from scratch, even if it means disappointing people who have benefited from your willingness to settle for crumbs, even if it means facing an uncertain future alone, rather than a predictable future with someone who doesn't truly see or value or cherish the gift of your presence in their life. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment below sharing how it affected you. And don't forget to follow the channel. This old grandmother has many more stories that need to be told, stories that might just change someone's life, and I'll be here whenever you need a reminder that you're stronger than you think and braver than you know and deserving of every good thing this world has to offer.